Slovakia and Poland have been among the strongest of Ukraine's allies within Europe. As Ukraine's war with Russia grinds on, could that solidarity be showing signs of cracking? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Slovakia and Poland will soon be heading to the polls. In Slovakia, the leading candidate for Prime Minister has promised to end weapons shipments to Ukraine. Meanwhile, Poland's ruling party is trying to appeal to far-right skeptics of the Ukraine war in a bid to stay in power. With winter approaching, could Ukraine be losing support among some key allies just when it needs them the most?
This is Robert Fico. His populist party is the front-runner in Slovakia's upcoming parliamentary election. Victory for Fico could reverse support for Ukraine from one of its staunchest European allies.
We will not send a single bullet to Ukraine from the state stocks.
Fico has led Slovakia twice before and is running against the incumbent party for a third stint in power. He opposes EU sanctions against Russia and wants to use Slovakia's membership in NATO to block Ukraine from joining. Meanwhile, support for Ukraine from another erstwhile ally, Poland, also appears to be wavering. Lagging behind his rivals, Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki is trying to capitalise on growing anger over the war among some Poles.
We are no longer transferring any weapons to Ukraine because we are now arming ourselves with the most modern weapons.
Slovakia and Poland have been among the world's biggest donors of aid to Ukraine as a percentage of their economies, handing over a far greater portion of their GDP than their larger European neighbours or the US and the UK. But a row over grain shipments has soured the public mood in the two countries. With Ukraine's Black Sea ports blocked, it's been forced to move grain by rail through its neighbours, angering farmers there. Slovakia, Poland and Hungary imposed national restrictions on Ukrainian grain purchases after an EU ban lapsed. So are Slovakia and Poland about to make a pivot towards Russia, or is it mere electioneering bluster?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Bratislava is Elena Kuchko, Vice President for Policy and Programming at GlobeSec, which is a global think tank. Joining us from New York is Andrzej Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. In Warsaw is Marcin Zaborowski, Advisor to the Polish Senate. And joining us here in the studio with me today in London is Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Jamie, I'll come to you first. You've met Robert Fico many, many times. Give us your impression of him and his politics.
Well, he certainly comes across as a rational person. I mean, he's a populist, and we've seen all of his statements on the campaign trail on NATO, the EU, Ukraine, and we'll obviously be discussing these in the programme in just a moment. But I met him before he came to power the first time, some years back, when he was a regular visitor to Brussels, and I had dinner with him on a number of occasions at the home of the Polish ambassador to NATO. And what struck me at the time was that although, yes, he's a populist, he was also somebody who wanted to make sure that he knew how NATO worked and knew how the EU worked. So I would call him a clever populist, who at least tries to make sure that he knows what's going on more broadly, rather than a knee-jerk emotional populist. But nonetheless, he's a populist. But when I knew him, at least back in the 1990s and the turn of the century, at least he was somebody who I think generally wanted to have some sort of idea of what was going on beyond Slovakia.
Elena, you're in the Slovakian capital right now. Just tell us, he's riding high in the polls right now, Fico, 21%. What kind of a politician domestically is he? What's he saying to the people of Slovakia? What's he offering?
Robert Fico is definitely trying to appeal to the segment of the population that feels resentment and that feels a little bit left behind by the previous governments. He's riding the wave of promises saying that he will try to stop the war in Ukraine as a way to make sure that the economy goes back to normal, that inflation goes back to normal. But in general, he's doing the same political promises that he has done before, meaning he is saying that there are a lot of people in Slovakia, maybe lower middle class, who are not enjoying the prosperity that they deserve, and his policies and politics, if he comes to power, will be devoted to making sure that their life is much better.
And Elena, what's your reading of it? Do you think he will win enough by himself, or will he have to form a coalition?
He is now polling at 21%, which is definitely not enough to form the government in itself. No party, whoever wins, will be able to form a government and rule without the coalition. What kind of coalition can be formed is a very tricky question. Slovakia's system is structured in a way that the party has to pass 5% thresholds to have seats in the parliament. And there are quite a few parties who are right now at the margin. So it's very unclear how many parties are going to make it at all, which means that the pool of potential coalition partners can be either wider or smaller, and they can have more or less say in the next government's priorities.
Andre, I want to bring you in. Fico is on record as saying that if he wins this election in a few days' time, he will withdraw from supporting Ukraine. Are you concerned about what you've been hearing from Fico?
Of course, during a time of war, any kind of agitation like that is kind of concerning. But given my time in the area, specifically in Western Ukraine or Transcarpathian Ukraine, knowing their interrelations with all of those 7 border nations, it has become very clear to me that the populism that has been expressed at this table today stems from a centuries-long triangulation strategy by many of the people who have been caught in between great European powers, whether that is Russia on the Far East, Germany, France, to the extent to the West. And as we've seen most recently with the country of Hungary, it is what populist leaders who stand against an international consensus can gain for their particular countries that is prodding countries like Slovakia and the populism there to try to extract some concessions from the EU or even from Russia if they were to play along with them. I don't think that's the wisest strategy in the long term, but it is certainly something that has brought electoral results to, say, the country of Hungary for a very long time now.
Marcin, Fico is a populist, he's a Slovak nationalist, and he's promising, I read a quote recently, to, quote, make Slovakia great again. I mean, this sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
It does indeed, yes. It's just a brand of Trumpism which exists throughout Central Europe, the appeal of which is quite popular. It's a sort of a revolt against the liberal forces, against the forces of establishment. What all these populist parties have in common is the rejection of globalization, and they portraying themselves as defending the weaker people against the evil forces of globalization. All these parties are also anti-immigrant. They don't like migration, and if they're European, they tend to be anti-European or Eurosceptic in some shape and form. In that context, actually, Robert Fico's party is relatively moderate when seen against the background of other populist forces across Central and Eastern Europe.
Jamie, he plays on conspiracy theories. He's pro-Kremlin. What do you make of all of this? Is this just for a domestic audience, or should people in Europe be genuinely concerned about this man becoming Prime Minister again?
Well, this, of course, is part of an election campaign, and it's always the case everywhere that you have heated rhetoric during election campaigns, big promises, threats. But, of course, in the grey light of dawn, particularly in the kind of coalition politics that were described, you have more moderate views. I mean, for example, take Viktor Orban of Hungary, who's been around for a long time. He's constantly saying that he's going to block Ukraine's membership of NATO because of bilateral disputes over Hungarian minorities. But then he shows up, as he did recently at the NATO summit in Vilnius, and signs up to an agreed consensual NATO declaration that clearly lays forward a roadmap for Ukraine to join NATO. So I think to some degree, there are words and there are actions, and we have to distinguish between the two. There's also a president of Slovakia, a lady who has been sort of an EU pro-NATO moderate, and often where you have a president of one ilk and a prime minister of another ilk, that also to some degree forces a certain degree of moderation. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out. However, what I would say briefly is that the organisation is represented here by one of my colleagues, Globsec, one of Europe's most prominent think tanks, has done regular polling of Slovakia, and it is a bit worrying for somebody like me with a NATO background. It shows that in Slovakia, support for NATO has dropped from 72% to today only 48%. 50% don't trust the United States. Only 31% back Zelensky. The war in Ukraine is unpopular in the country. So Fico is building, if you like, on a bedrock of greater skepticism towards the Brussels institutions, and as was said earlier, but globalization more generally. Indeed, a Globsec opinion poll back in 2022 showed that 50% of Slovaks believe that the world is governed by secret elites. So the conspiracy theories are deeply entrenched. Some people put that down to Russian disinformation, but clearly Fico is not coming out of nowhere.
Elena, Jamie mentioned your president there, Zuzana Kaputova. She's not running for re-election next year, and Fico has described her as an American agent. How does all this play out with the average Slovakian family on the street?
Jamie mentioned something very important, and that's the state of mind of Slovak citizens. That's been the case for quite some years in Slovakia. First, Slovaks have traditionally very prone to disinformation. We have been measuring the way how people believe or do not believe in different conspiracy theories, which also means that Fico is trying to give people what they believe in.
Andre, how concerned should we be about that kind of rhetoric, that you've got a prime minister effectively denouncing a president as an American agent? All of this conspiracy theory stuff that some people certainly lap up on the internet, but this is filtering into an election campaign.
I will remind everybody that we've had a number of populists elected around the world. The United States certainly had to weather its share of populism and conspiracy theories from an elected president. Certainly, even Ukraine, their 2019 election was certainly seen as a populist election. But in that respect, reality interfered, and the president ended up being exactly the right person that was needed at the time. We can't really tell what's going to happen in the future for Slovakia, but at the very least, we know that NATO forces are going to be ramping up their series of deployments around the border areas of the eastern flank. And to stand against that is to throw away money. It's certainly true in the United States that people can complain about money being, quote unquote, sent to Ukraine, while at the same time it's employing welders, it's employing lower class skilled jobs that are desperately needed across the United States in areas of munitions building. So similarly, there could be populist rhetoric on one hand about standing against the great Western power, but at the same time, that money and investment is definitely needed by those smaller countries.
Marcin, Poland is in the middle of quite an acrimonious election campaign at the moment. A lot of people in Europe have raised eyebrows at some of the things your government have been saying and doing recently, notably saying they would withdraw support for Ukraine. What's going on in your election campaign?
Well, I think that the cases of both Slovakia and Poland now are showing that we are experiencing some kind of a Ukraine fatigue. You probably can see it also in the United States with the primary election. That really, throwing the support for Ukraine at the moment is election in terms of the election logic is becoming kind of questionable. So the even in Poland, which is which used to have a consensus on everything Ukraine related, in the weeks into running up into the election, we see the party of the government ramping up an, I wouldn't say anti-Ukrainian, but Ukraine skeptical campaign. When they made big thing about the banning the import of grain to Poland. Then they make a big thing about like ceasing to deliver military aid to Ukraine, which is actually not true. But they did make this argument, and they are even making the argument now about cutting on some of the social support for the Ukrainian refugees. And that's clearly there in order to win a part of the electorate, which is, tired, no longer interested, and is experiencing some fatigue. You also have a far-right party in Poland, which is on the right of the party governing in Poland, and they are competing for similar electorate.
Jamie, I want to pick up on one phrase there Marcin used, Ukraine fatigue. If this plays out across several more countries in the next 6 to 12 months, I mean, the big winner here is Vladimir Putin, surely?
Absolutely, because I'm convinced that that's Putin's strategy to sort of wait it out, to hope, for example, that Donald Trump is elected next year. He said he's going to deal with the Ukraine conflict in 24 hours. But certainly under a Trump administration, US support for Ukraine will go down. And as Marcin rightly said, even before we have the elections in the United States next year, we see, for example, some of the Republicans give Zelensky, when he visited Washington last week, a fairly cool reception. And the latest aid package of $24 billion is being held up in Congress. So we're right, the signs are there. On the other hand, I would say that what the EU could usefully do is, looking again at Central and Eastern Europe, is to try to take away some of the immediate irritants, which are helping people like Fico and other populists in the current election cycle. Two examples. Number one, illegal migration. It's gone up 9 times this year in Slovakia, although albeit small by the standards of Italy at the moment, but 9 times, with illegal migrants coming across the border. The news today is that Poland is looking at border controls vis-a-vis Slovakia because of migrants crossing and so on. So if the EU could come up with a common migration policy and control this a little bit better, it would remove a big rug from under the feet of the populace. Secondly, what Maciek mentioned very briefly, the grain issue, where today Slovakia and other Eastern European states have called on the EU to put checks on the solidarity corridors for Ukrainian grain coming in, depressing the prices for the local farmers. Again, if the EU could get a grip on that so that the grain would go to international markets and not depress prices, another rug from under the feet of the populace would be lifted.
Elena, to you, how do people in Slovakia feel about the whole Ukraine war? You've taken in 115,000 refugees from Ukraine. Do you feel people are getting tired of talking about it, tired of seeing it in the news, and tired of helping?
People in general are tired of being asked to be patient and being asked to help somebody. It started already during COVID pandemic, when people were repeatedly asked to do some sacrifices because of the situation externally. But then came an extension of the situation also with the war in Ukraine. Indeed, a lot of Ukrainians came to Slovakia. By the way, the reception was very smooth. In general, there's not too much resentment against Ukrainians in the country, simply because they integrate so well. Because they learn the language, they get jobs. It's mostly women, children, elderly people. But also a lot of Ukrainians actually left Slovakia and moved further to the west to other countries as well. So proportionally, it's not that many. Of course, it's quite a lot still, given that Slovakia in the past did not experience huge migration flows. But indeed, there is this accumulation of fatigue, and there is a part of the population that thinks that for the past years, it was about somebody else. It was not about me. So it's time also to elect the government who would put me first. Hence the slogan of making Slovakia great again, of putting Slovaks first, is very popular among certain segments of the population.
Andrei, does it worry you what you've just been hearing, that phrase, Ukraine fatigue? How does that make you feel?
I've heard it from the very beginning of the war. I've heard the words off-ramp and endgame repeatedly as well. Frankly, that's not how we, prosecute wars and war crimes. Things have a slow and methodic method. From the Ukrainian side, they can turn to the grain issue and say, if you had only supported a free grain corridor through the Black Sea from the very beginning, we would not be having these issues. But the West was reluctant on doing that, even though they have the full power of control of the skies and what have you, to make sure that the grain ships can travel unimpeded from Odessa straight down through the Bosphorus. That is primarily how Ukraine has been transporting grain from it. It doesn't even have the infrastructure to ship it through rail into Europe, and Europe and the United States thought it would be the best idea. So there are various sides to all of these issues, but first and foremost, I think it's about going and talking to the people directly. The issue in the United States was mentioned earlier. It's very fascinating when those people speak in Washington, and yet when it comes to issuing official state proclamations of support for Ukraine, whether it was Ukraine's Independence Day this past August, I had Republican governor after Republican governor in deep red states in the South, whether it's South Carolina, Georgia, states like Nebraska, coming out and saying we support the people of Ukraine. So it's all about how you phrase these questions as well. There's many people who are polled and asked, should we give money to Ukraine? Absolutely not. And then you ask them whether you want Ukraine or Russia to win. Absolutely, I want Ukraine to win. So there's a dichotomy in terms of the logic, but that's what populism feeds on. And we are fighting a war against, we as the West are fighting a war against an adversary that is very skilled in manipulation of public opinion.
Marcin, how big an issue will Ukraine be in the Polish elections, do you feel?
Well, it is becoming the issue, and increasingly so. And I think it's a deliberate strategy of the current government to ramp up some tensions there and not to find an agreement on deal, because agreement on the grain issue is actually within a reach. But I don't think the current government actually wants to reach this agreement. They want to keep portraying themselves. We are defending the countryside. We are defending the farmers. We will not let Zelensky talk to us the way he did at the United Nations, because we stand up for Poland and we stand up for your interests. So I think that that's gonna play out for another 3 weeks that we have left until the election. And after the election, they will say we actually didn't quite mean it. They will try to make good, and they will try to make an agreement as soon as possible, because at the end of the day, the common enemy here is Russia, and the perceptions in Poland are very anti-Russian. So, but the government probably does not realize what kind of a dangerous game it plays out at the moment. Or, well, maybe it does realize, but it doesn't care. These people are just so focused on domestic politics that nothing else matters.
Jamie, you're in Brussels every day with your work. You're talking to officials. How worried are they that they're hearing what we've been hearing on the show today?
Well, obviously, it's not good if we have governments who are elected who are questioning the effort to support Ukraine, saying that Ukraine should not join NATO. In the case of Hungary, even not going ahead ratifying Sweden's membership of NATO, which to my mind makes absolutely no sense, particularly at a time where Turkey has said that it will move ahead with that ratification next month. But on the other hand, if you're in the alliance, you're used to handling domestic politics. You're used to having elections, particularly with 31 member states. Your job as the Secretary General is to keep the family together, and it's the same for the EU leadership as well. As I've said, there is a difference between what people say and what they do when they turn up at summits and put their signature to the agreements. Somehow the great sort of ship moves on. For example, there was a meeting at Ramstein of the Ukraine Support Group last week, which is headed by the United States Secretary of Defense, and the pledges totaled $78 billion of support for Ukraine in the pipeline, which shows it's not all coming from the United States. So again, yes, expect turbulence. That's the nature of domestic politics today. But at the end of the day, it's what comes out of these big international meetings. And for the time being, the weapons, the ammunition are flowing to Ukraine and the counteroffensive continues.
Elena, my final question is to you. How worried are you about Russian interference, social media, a lot of toxic material being pumped out, pro-Kremlin, that Slovaks are seeing every day on various different social media networks?
Russia has been good at one thing. They know how to intervene effectively and low cost at places where they can achieve the maximum impact. And Slovakia is one of those, has been historically very friendly towards Russia. Given the political situation in the country, there's always a possibility to find willing politicians who will wittingly or unwittingly spread the same narrative that's in the interest of the Kremlin. And of course, social media is helping a lot. Also, if you look at the number of the active pages on social media from Facebook to Instagram and elsewhere, Russian embassies, Russian websites have been one of the most active and the ones that are also having a lot of reach. So of course, it's a situation of concern.
Thank you, Elena, Andre, Marcin, and Jamie. That's all we have time for. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.